Hi everybody, welcome back to the series on ethics. We have been working on normative ethics lately, and the last topic that we covered was utilitarianism, which out of the theories that we're going to discuss may be one of the simplest, in that the principle is fairly straightforward. The greatest good for the greatest number of people, or the greatest pleasure or happiness for the greatest number of people. And even though that is intuitively a very attractive principle, we looked at some problems when you actually work things out. Today we're going to be turning to a very different system. This one is basically the opposite of utilitarianism at almost every important point. It's called deontological ethics most normally, or simply Kantian deontological ethics. And we've introduced the word deontology before when we were talking about divine command theory. Here we're going to be looking at the system that is normally called deontological. So let's dive in. Kant is not an easy philosopher. If anybody has actually studied Kant before, you're probably very well aware of this. I am not an expert on Kant by any means, but at least we're going to be dealing with his ethics and not with his epistemology and metaphysical issues, though we're going to have to, as often in the past, touch on metaphysics where it's relevant to his ethics. And unfortunately, that's unavoidable. As we dive in, remember, I usually give you terms. I try to introduce you to some of the vocabulary that we're going to be using. And again, deontologism, from the Greek word deon, meaning duty, or that which is binding. Now, it's Kant's duty theory that we could actually think of as a denial of all the principles of utilitarianism, or all the key points of utilitarianism at all the weak points. Because rather than looking at consequences as determining what is a good act versus a bad act, we're going to be looking at the absolutely opposite area of things, which is the motivation behind the act, or especially the duty that requires us to act. So utilitarianism, we said, neglects human rights. That was one of the criticisms. We saw that it doesn't recognize the individual human right, doesn't recognize maybe the role, not the role, but the importance of taking care of the minority, when majority opinion basically is the one that's going to carry the day after all. And we even looked at some scenarios where we said it kind of cuts against our moral intuition, where you do something that you would have to normally see, or something that it would normally see as immoral, but on a utilitarian principle would have to say that it is the moral thing to do. And the examples that we gave were, of course, like the execution of jaywalkers, the lynch mob scenario, things like that. So anyways, utilitarianism, like as we said, often neglects, or is accused of neglecting, human rights and intrinsically binding duties, and downplays the relevance of motive. Okay, remember, motive doesn't really matter. It's only the consequences that matter when we judge something to be good or bad. Now, the deontological theory, of course, bases all rightness on the duties and on the motive. Motive actually becomes the only relevant issue, to the extent where it doesn't really matter what the consequences are. So there may be some weak aspects of this theory in a very different direction. So the difference between duty theory and utilitarianism actually goes beyond the theories, because both of the theories would give a different interpretation on particular actions. So let's just look at a couple basic examples here where we could disagree on the rightness of certain actions. So imagine a situation where nobody's around and you promise to scatter a dying friend's ashes in the ocean upon their request, right? The question is, do you have to do this? Do you have to carry through with this action? Well, it depends, again, whether you are a Kantian or a utilitarian. So on duty theory, or the Kantian viewpoint, he would say, yes, you do have an obligation to do this, where the utilitarian wouldn't see any reason why, because whether you do it or not, nobody's going to be harmed, nobody's going to be given any additional happiness, and it might actually be the other direction, where you are now inconvenienced and the net overall unhappiness is being maximized, maybe we should say. Different scenarios. Living in a police state, you find a revolutionary friend coming to hide in your house, and then the police come and knock on the door and ask if you know where the person is. The question here is, do you lie? Well, on the utilitarian theory, no. Actually, yes, you would lie. But on the Kantian theory, you would not be able to lie. So again, your actions are going to be very different whether you're using a utilitarian theory or a Kantian theory to determine what you're going to do. Now, I'm going to skip that. We're going to do a brief introduction to deontological theory. And what I want to do is kind of walk through the 6 moral questions, which I usually skim over. I'm not going to go through them all, but I am going to at least use that as an introduction for where we're going to be going in the rest of the presentation, because it's a rather lengthy and information-packed presentation. So again, deontological moral theory is basically, we could use that interchangeably with duty theory. So if I use duty theory or deontology or Kantian ethics, just remember these are all going to be interchangeable for the purposes today. The idea is some acts are morally binding, independent of what follows from them. That's why I said consequences don't matter. The obligatory nature of an action is independent of benefit. So again, a benefit would be a consequence. Particular goals I'm trying to attain would be consequences. But the binding nature of an action has nothing to do with whether or not it's going to get me to those ends, or whether or not it's going to be to my benefit or something along those lines. So duty theory doesn't have this connection to desire the way egoism would, okay, or the way utilitarianism would. And if it happens that an action makes you happy or promotes your happiness, we'd say that's, a nice thing, but it's merely accidental, because that's not the concern of Kant's theory. It's not to make you happy. It doesn't have this goal in mind. And maybe that makes it a less attractive theory. I think the ancient Greeks would ultimately see it not as a very practical or good ethical theory based on their whole idea of this goal for eudaimonia. Anyways, who is Immanuel Kant? Very brief introduction, very, very important modern philosopher, maybe the most important modern philosopher. His dates were 1724 to 1804, and I put a few of his works down here on the screen so that you could see. The Critique of Pure Reason may be his most famous work, very complicated piece of writing there. Prolegomena in Future Metaphysics, the Foundation of Metaphysics of Morals, the Critique of Practical Reason, and the Metaphysics of Morals, the last 3 particularly dealing with ethical thought. So as we go through these 6 questions, I'm just going to point out, like I said, kind of an outline of where we're going. So remember, the 6 questions are, first, the moral psychology question, and we're going to be looking at the different aspects that Kant believes goes into making human actions. Most of them that we naturally do come from human desire. I mean, human desire is an incredible motivating factor and thing that we take into consideration when we go after certain things. Human reason, and then the most important of the 3 for him is going to be the free will. Maybe I shouldn't say it's the most important for him. It's a very important part, but I probably shouldn't put it higher than reason, because reason is ultimately going to be one of the foundations for his entire ethical theory. So again, reason, desire, and free will are the aspects of the human psychology that we're going to be talking about. And the second question, we call it the content question. We're going to be looking at mainly what we know as the categorical imperative, and we're going to compare it to what we might term a hypothetical imperative and see why one can be a moral law and why one can't. And again, if you're taking the class, that's a potential essay question that you're going to need to write on. The third is the justification question. Why are we obligated? And here we're going to be looking at this idea of an a priori synthetic judgment. What exactly does that mean? The fourth is the motivation question, where we're going to look at the basic incentives, whether we're going to be acting out of desire for happiness or respect for some kind of moral law. And we're going to talk about the free choice that goes into picking between those, the idea of choosing our own motivation. The fifth question is the ontological source question. We're talking about basically the ground for the entire system, which is going to go back to what we call the pure practical reason. We'll have to unpack that a little bit. And then the final question is the moral education question, which asks, again, what we need to know before becoming a moral person. All right. So that's kind of where we're going. Now I'm going to slow down a little bit and we're going to dig in deep. And as you've seen in the past PowerPoints, there's going to be sections that repeat. Okay, so I'm going to try to look at the screen and edit out things that I think are overly repetitious, but sometimes repetition is very important, right? So that you can get through to the key ideas. It's a way of emphasizing these things and helping you remember them. So let's go in detail to Kantian deontological ethics, starting with the moral psychology. And we're talking here the freedom of the will, like I said, being of paramount importance. So the three faculties that drive all human action are these. The reason. So what is the reason? Let's take them each one at a time. Three components of the reason that Kant talks about. You have what's called the pure reason, which is the capacity to envision concepts free of empirical input, kind of like you cut off from the world as you're contemplating concepts. Second is the prudential reason, which has to do with envisioning actions that you should take to achieve objects that you desire, right? Certain goals that you have in mind. And then the practical reason, which is the capacity to envision what ought to be done just purely in the name of goodness. And it's this last one, in a way combined with the first one, that are going to be the most important for his ethical theory. The rational nature alone could be the ground of absolute moral laws and absolute laws in general. Okay, so when we get to the ontology question, we're going to see we don't need something beyond this pure practical reason, which I mentioned a second ago. The rational nature is for him an end in itself. Okay, so that's the first thing, is the human reason. Number two is desire. Kant's view of human beings is as basic hedonists, right? He thinks humans are basically self-interested pleasure seekers, and very narrowly self-interested. The desiring faculty, he believed, couldn't be educated. When I mean by desiring faculty, I just mean the ability that you have, the capacity you have to desire. This is not something you can train. It's not something you can refine or shape. There aren't different degrees of, better, worse, higher, lower. What he thinks of desires is this is something, at least as far as morality is concerned, just needs to be ignored. Right? We curb our desires. We control our desires. If there is a highest or best virtue, maybe we could call it the self-control aspect. It's the ability to ignore the desire. And maybe I'm overstating things when I go there. Okay. Now, the desires definitely affect you, but they don't determine you. And this is really important. You are never absolutely determined by desire or anything else. Okay. And the freedom, remember, is very important for ethics. The third is the freedom, the free will, or the Willkür. This is the ability not only to make a choice, but the ability to even choose our motives for making a choice. So it's the ability to act in an undetermined way, and that ability is going to be what allows us to deny our desires. It allows the agent to satisfy their duties, because the duties are often put in contrast with the desires. You've got desires on one hand, and you've got duties on the other hand. And our awareness of this freedom happens when we realize that there's this conflict between the two, right? We feel these morally binding duties, and we also feel this pull for self-gratification by satisfying our desires. And then to will is simply to seek a goal. And it's a rational thing as long as it's governed by what we call a maxim or a policy. So we'll talk about developing maxims, what those are, as we progress. But your will has the ability to navigate between the two. And you're, like I said, consciously aware of it when you feel the contrast between them. Like I said, we're not determined. Human action is not determined either by reason or desire. If we're obligated to do something, then Kant reasons we have to be free to do it, because, again, it doesn't make sense to say we're obligated unless there's freedom. He believes man is obligated, therefore man is free. Now, justification of this idea of freedom is going to be a little bit difficult for Kant as we get later on into his metaphysics, so he's going to try to justify it in a transcendental way, as we'll explain later. Another couple terms that are worth noting for Kant is this idea of autonomy versus heteronomy. Autonomy we've seen before. It's this idea that man is a legislator for his own behavior. He's a self-maker, right? He makes his own laws. And man is free when he doesn't follow inclination or some kind of external force. right? But he's free when he follows his reason. A little different than the existentialist, though existentialism again embraces this idea of autonomy as well. But the autonomous will for Kant always is going to submit to a law that is self-legislated by the reason, all right? And that's a good thing. Now, heteronomy, which actually just means another law, is when we operate according to inclinations that we have, maybe according to character or to some kind of external legislation. And the limitation of the will to follow a law other than itself in seeking a purpose or object. The heteronomous will for Kant always submits itself to some other end. Okay. And the principle for its actions are a little bit different than the autonomous will. Autonomy is associated with the categorical imperative, where heteronomy is associated with what we might call hypothetical imperative. A man's not free, Kant believes, if he follows his inclinations, okay? Because the inclinations are the way we tend to behave, and in a way they're not fully chosen, right? Because our desires aren't things that we generally choose. They tend to have a command over us. So, for example, hunger compels us to satisfy this. That desire compels us to take certain behaviors. Now, remember, he believes that man is completely free to choose his motive. And this is a strange thought we'll look at a little bit later, but choosing to follow desire or inclination, he believes, gives up your freedom, right? Gives up autonomy, because inclination and desires compel in a way that respect for law and respect for duty just don't. Okay? So the idea in Kant is we want to be autonomous lawmakers, and we're not going to be followers of some kind of heteronomy. Second section, now that we've gone through the moral psychology, is to look at the content. Okay? Probably the most important term in all of Kantian ethics is the categorical imperative. So we want to talk about exactly what that is, because this is going to be the key principle. And if you want to think about it this way, it is not only the key principle by which we judge all other laws for behavior and determine whether something is going to be good or not. You could call all laws, in a way, categorical imperatives, maybe with a small c, in that all these laws are going to command us in an unconditional way, which is what a categorical imperative is. So our moral duties, we've got these intuition, right? We intuit moral duties. We have a sense of this oughtness that tells us what we should and should not do. And we become aware of these duties through this experience. Now, an obligation implies that there's a moral law. I'm just kind of reasoning through at this point, right? An obligation implies that there's a moral law, but a moral law implies that there's some kind of reason, because laws are rational. Laws are set up in a particular way. For Kant, these cannot be derived a posteriori, and there's a word I don't remember if we've seen before. We're going to see it again later as well. This is the idea of after experience, right? So we don't derive our laws after experience merely from facts about the world, because facts are always particular things, and Kant is interested in a universal type of a law. So you can't use particulars to come up with these universals, right? Any more than in logic, you could start with a truth about a particular thing and then generalize to the whole, right? So we can't say that something's true of the part, therefore it's true of the whole. It's the same thing that he's saying here. So what we have to do is actually posit these laws, and these laws are then derived a priori, meaning prior to experience, and they're derived from the pure practical reason, which we'll discuss later. And any of these laws we can call categorical imperatives, which is just an imperative without regard to desires, without regard to ends, without regard to consequences. Now, these duties that are in laws we come up with, we impose. We basically start by making what we might call maxims, which are these personal policies. And then we can impose them on ourselves, we can impose them on other people. And remember, morality is always a constraint for human behavior because we're trying to ignore our desires. So what exactly is a maxim? Well, a maxim is for our purposes at this point, just a personal policy of behavior, a personal policy of action, and we can call it subjective because it's my policy or it's your policy. And this is going to be determined by just basic technical and prudential reasoning as to what are the best actions that are going to get me to the desires or goals that I have in mind. And so, for example, you could have a policy like, I'll take a canteen of water with me whenever I walk in the desert. That's not a bad plan, right? Or I could say, whenever food is offered to me, I'm going to accept it and I'm going to say thank you. Those might be examples of personal, subjective maxims. Now, a maxim is determined by an individual in light of their pure practical reason. And like I said, as a subjective policy, it's a policy of the will. It's not, strictly speaking, a law when I come up with the policy for myself. The moral law has to be objective. So what we want to do is have some kind of universalized maxim, some kind of maxim or policy that applies not just to me, but to everybody. And if one's maxim passes a test of the categorical imperative, then it goes from being subjective to objective. So there's a way to actually get this objectivity that we're looking for within our moral system. And it becomes binding and an imperative for all people if it passes the test. Now, this is the supreme law. So if I was to ask you what is the general principle behind all of Kantian ethics, what is the supreme moral law by which we determine, rightness or wrongness of any type of activity, you're going to say it's the categorical imperative. It's the one moral principle. This slide is just, again, going back through those words, categorical and imperative, so that you understand what we're talking about. Remember, an imperative is simply a command. Categorical means that it's absolute and it's binding in spite of circumstances. Okay, so this is definitely not a situational ethic. This is an ethic that is going to be consistent across situations. All right, so this is absolute command, universal command that we're going to be talking about. And that's going to be in contrast to what we might call the hypothetical imperative. Now, hypothetical imperative is a command, but it is a command with regards to a particular goal or an end that you have in mind, where the categorical imperative doesn't pay attention to the end. So we're going to have to distinguish between the two, and Kant is not going to say they're of equal value. At least maybe we should say they don't have equal moral worth. Only the categorical imperatives are going to be called moral commands. An imperative is any claim about what we should do. Hypothetical imperatives tell us what we ought to do in order to. Okay, that's the key. In order to reach some desired end. Hypothetical also means conditional. Categorical, unconditional. So there's a very quick way to distinguish the two. A conditional proposition is, again, hinging on a condition. It's an imperative only in certain situations. It's not always an imperative. So it's a command that tells us what we have to do under specific variable conditions. So if X is the case, then Y. It's conditional on a desire. So we can think of, if I want X or if I desire X, then I ought to do Y. So that's the form of a hypothetical, logically speaking. All empirical or factual imperatives are hypothetical, since they're binding only so long as certain conditions apply, right? And there'd be different situations, and none of these are ever binding on everybody. And even if it's binding on some people, it's never binding at all times on that person. Okay, it's an imperative of prudence. It doesn't actually command, and they can be helpful in navigating the world, but they're not what we would call an obligation. Okay, since a hypothetical can't be moral, it can't be an obligation. It can't be something you have to do. Example, if I want to avoid punishment, I tell the truth. You should fulfill contractual obligations if you want to get more clients. Now, you could probably notice right with these examples and the ones that I gave before that I can avoid the obligation, right? So if I want to avoid punishment, there's my condition. I tell the truth. Or you could say, I ought to tell the truth. Now, it seems like you have an obligation to tell the truth. But the fact is that obligation is only applicable when the condition is in place. So if I want to avoid punishment, then I should tell the truth. But if I give up the desire to avoid punishment, then along with it goes this obligation to tell the truth. That's kind of the problem for Kant, right? They can come and go and change, and we don't want a moral law that is changeable. We want a moral law that is solid, certain, universal, and has no exceptions to it. That's the basic idea of the categorical. All right, so categorical imperatives are unconditional. They command certain behavior regardless of its consequences. We don't care about what happens, which sounds bad, but this is what we're saying. But we're doing it because of its rightness, okay? A command is binding universally on all rational creatures, okay? It assumes rationality. That's why rationality, I said, is got to be as important as freedom in his basic system. All right, like I said, it's never concerned with an end. Obligation is not based on considerations. It's guided by what we call the goodwill, which we'll have to take a look at later, but it's the will of the person to do its duty only for the sake of doing duty. And that last line actually says, act in conformity with duty from duty. Okay, it doesn't mean act in conformity with duty because you desire to. Right? Acting in conformity with duty just means act in a way that is, parallels what your duties are. Act according to those duties. But you have to do it from the right motive, which is from a sense of duty, not from a sense of wanting to or desiring to. Maybe I should say, because when I use vague terms, it gets a little confusing. Okay, so that's the key motive here. For this reason, the only moral acts are those that follow a categorical imperative. No motive except rightness of action is going to be of concern. All right, there's pure respect for the moral law. Like I said, acting according to duty from duty. So, for example, X is not conditional on a desire. We're just going to say it's right to do X, perhaps tell the truth. Therefore, it follows that I ought to tell the truth. And this is a slide that I actually had in the introductory lecture PowerPoint, where we're comparing what we might call deontic logic with formal logic, and just showing you kind of an introduction to the different types of arguments. At that point, we were really concerned with kind of a formal logical structure, just so you understand how you work from premises to conclusions. But here's a basic hypothetical argument where, I want to get to school on time, and to get to school on time, I must catch the 12 o'clock bus. Therefore, I must catch the 12 o'clock bus. Or we could say it in a more overtly hypothetical fashion. If I want to get to school on time, then I must catch the 12 o'clock bus. I do want to get to school on time. Therefore, I must catch the 12 o'clock bus. And that's, a valid argument as far as the structure goes. Deontic argument is very different. It doesn't have the two premises that lead us to some kind of conclusion. It's simply represented here by this very short argument. It's wrong to steal. Conclusion being, I must not do it. Okay. Now, there's no obligation in this first formal argument up top, but there is an obligation in the second, because the first one, being hypothetical, we could, of course, give up the condition. And the second one, there isn't an opportunity to, because there's no condition in there. Kant actually thinks that the conclusion in this deontological argument follows rationally and with certainty, without the need of a second premise, because he believes that when you understand what wrongness is, if I say it's wrong to steal, then you automatically know that it would be irrational to think otherwise, to think that you should do something. It just simply follows. Now, there are different formulations that we have for the categorical imperative, and I'm going to give you all of them, though I really would only like you to know the first two for testing purposes. Okay, so the first two you definitely have to know. Formulation 1 is the most famous. It's called the formula of universal law, which says to act only according to that maxim which you can will to become a universal law, or act only according to rules of conduct that you wish that others would legislate for themselves as well. Now, if you notice on the screen, I've got the golden rule placed right below here. The idea of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. but there's a question mark after it. So we're going to need to come back and talk about why that's in there. But for now, if you think about the formula of universal law, it does sound a little bit like the golden rule, the idea of acting only according to that maxim that you wish to be a universal law that everybody, again, would act according to. Do unto others as you would have everybody else do unto you. Some people have suggested that the categorical imperative in a way breaks down to the golden rule, or that the two are basically the same thing. Others disagree heavily. So we're going to take a look and see if they are actually the same, even though on the surface I can admit they do appear to be similar. Now the test for universalization is going to be really important, because this is how you can start to put your maxim through the thought process and figure out whether or not it's a good or bad maxim. All right, so you determine the content of your duty by applying the test of universalization. Can you will the principle or your maxim that you're acting on to be a universal moral law? If willing your maxim to become a universal law contains no self-contradiction, then we could say it's consistent with our duty. If willing your maxim to be a universal law does involve some kind of self-contradiction, then it is irrational and therefore immoral. So what I'm saying is, whatever maxim you come up with, whatever personal policy behavior you come up with, you need to figure out if universalizing it, making it a law that everybody has to follow, is going to result in a problem. So let me show you or walk you through how this is done. So applying the categorical imperative for testing maxims is done this way. First, we develop the maxim, which is generally in the form of I do action A in circumstance C to attain end E. Plug in whatever you want for the letters. Second step is you generalize and say everybody's going to do action A in situation C to obtain end E. And then you imagine generalizing the maxim as a law. Not just that everybody does it, but everybody always does it. Everybody has to do it. And then you just imagine life under that law. Then you ask a question. Is it possible to act successfully on that maxim if everybody was doing it? If the answer is no, then the maxim is immoral and unlawful. If the answer is yes, we have to ask a further question. Is this a world in which I would be a willing member? If the answer again is no, then again the law is probably not a moral law, should be abandoned. Okay, or actually you should not follow it. If yes, then it's lawful and there's an obligation to follow it that comes along. Put it into a little bit more concrete example. Let's do the test of lying. So it's my maxim that I ought to lie in order to get whatever I want. Generalizing, I would say, well, everybody ought to lie in order to get what they want. Making it a law, I say everybody must lie always to get what they want. So here is a world where everybody is lying all the time in order to get what they want. So I want to imagine what that world is like. What is life like under this law? Well, everybody's lying all the time. Nobody's ever hearing the truth. Lying actually would cease to accomplish its goal, which is to deceive others. Because if everybody's always lying at all times, then everybody else knows that everybody's lying at all times, and the ability to deceive somebody just would not occur, right? Or wouldn't manifest. So when I ask the question, is it possible to act successfully on that maxim? Of course not. Therefore, that maxim is unlawful. It's unacceptable. So I've kind of went through that right there. Example 2, I'm not going to go through the whole walkthrough. You can kind of think, if you actually want to pause the video after I read the maxim out, you can kind of run it through the thought process on your own. But the maxim would be, out of respect for the moral law and out of self-imposed respect, I will not commit adultery. Now, if you think about it for a second, you'll realize it doesn't have any kind of real contradictions that make it impossible to act successfully in life with that kind of maxim. So this most likely does pass the categorical test. But the more bizarre question then comes up as to ethical behavior and what's morally praiseworthy. So I'm just going to introduce this as a question to contemplate, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later. But which seems more ethical now? You've got a person X who decides not to commit adultery out of self-imposed respect for the moral law, which he's determined to follow. Right? He's not going to commit adultery. Now, X wanted to commit adultery, but in the end, he decides not to simply because it's his duty. The other person we'll call person Y decides not to commit a duty because he doesn't want to. He doesn't have a desire to. He actually has a desire to remain faithful and loving to his wife. Now, both of these guys do the exact same action. They do not commit adultery. They remain faithful. Now, while not committing adultery is good, to do so autonomously seems to be not as moral as doing it out of love for one's spouse. When I say autonomously, I mean basically out of respect for the moral law. It seems like the guy on the surface, this may be our moral intuition or maybe just my moral intuition, it seems like the guy who loves his wife and wants to be faithful is doing the greater good, whereas the person that does want to cheat but just doesn't because of some kind of duty that they sense seems less moral. Okay? So to love to the degree that adultery is repugnant and that your commitment to your spouse is ingrained in your being or character, so that adultery is unthinkable does seem better. Now, the odd part here is Kant would be in disagreement with this intuition. He would, and we'll see that, like I said, coming up, but he would actually say person X is doing the more morally praiseworthy thing, not person Y. And you can think about why that might be based on what little you know of Kant already. And keep in mind, consequences don't matter. Now, objection to the universalization test needs to be brought up. It does seem when you put this test, you put a maxim through this test, we're looking at what is the world like as a result. Is that a world that it has a contradiction? Is that the consequence of putting this through the universalization test? Or is it a world that I couldn't possibly live in, or at least live in successfully? Again, looking at consequences of universalizing this maxim. So at this point you'd say, well, if the test is looking at consequences, how is Kantian ethics not some kind of consequentialist theory? The test does use consequences, so how is Kant not a consequentialist? Well, that's a problem, because some people think he is at this point. I, however, actually disagree. I don't think we actually have reverted to consequentialism. And this is the reason why. It's because consequences are not really the reason that the moral is unacceptable. What consequences serve is as a test to see if the maxim that we have is for my benefit. Okay? And if it puts me above the group. Because remember, I said Kantian ethics is concerned for individual human rights, not just personal self-interest. So if I act on a maxim that cannot be universalized, it shows that I'm acting on a maxim because it's something I think that will benefit me, kind of putting me above other people. So if you think of it that way, maybe it's not purely consequentialist or actually at all consequentialist, but just a test to see if I am giving myself some kind of special privileges or some special status in the greater human scope. Okay? Second, that was the first formulation, right? The formula of the universal law. Second formulation is the other one that I want you to know, is the formula of humanity as an end in itself. Okay, which is to treat all men as ends in themselves and not as means only. Okay, an end in itself means for its own sake, not as a means. Okay, basically it means don't use people. If you want to boil it down to some really basic way to phrase it. So Kant gives a second test for moral duties. Never treat people, I should say, merely as a means to an end. That's why I had the word only emphasized there. When we talk about using people, obviously at some points you have to use people, right? Human interaction means we cannot help doing that. If you're a student taking a class, if you're a person watching this video, in a way, you're using me, right? Because I'm providing you with information or maybe something that you need. Okay, but we don't think of that as necessarily an immoral action. The idea is we don't want to merely use somebody. We don't want to mislead. We don't want to cheat. We don't want to abuse somebody as a person to get what we want. That would constitute immorality. So this follows Kant's claims that the highest value is the rational nature, and Kant calls this test equivalent to the universalization test. So really, again, it's the same categorical imperative. It's just a different way of looking at it. Okay, so seeing people as ends in themselves supports a view of inalienable rights, which is very important here. A third formula, and the ones that I'm about to go through, I'm just going to read the law itself. Formula of natural law. So act as though the maxim of your action were by your will to become a universal law of nature. So the consequences here, we're not looking at necessarily some kind of logical problem or logical impossibility. We're actually looking at some kind of physical impossibility or some impossibility in the way the world would operate. Formula 4 is the formula of autonomy. Never choose except in such a way that the maxims of the choice are comprehended in the same volition as a universal law. You can see that some of them sound similar enough where you understand we're still talking about the same thing. And then the fifth and final formulation is called the formula of the realm of ends, that every rational being must act as if, by his maxims, he were at all times a legislative member of the universal realm of ends. So, a little bit more than you needed to know. Like I said, the first two, Formula 1 and Formula 2, are the ones that you need to know. So let's go back a little, talk about, to kind of wrap up the categorical imperative, why a moral principle has to be categorical and not hypothetical. We've already talked about it a bit, but I'm going to just unpack it a little bit more. So remember first that morality is a constraint on your desires. We want to curb those things. For Kant, desires are never going to make an action moral. The moral duty has to be universally binding, can't be conditionally binding. So a moral principle is one that you follow in being moral, and only a universally binding principle can be moral. So a moral principle has to be categorical. It just follows. Because if they were hypothetical, here's the problem. A person could give up the desires that the hypothetical imperative is conditional to. Right? If I want to succeed, then I ought to work hard. It's only binding as long as that desire remains in place, and if I give up the desire to succeed, then the ought goes with it. All right? So again, it takes into consideration desires, problem number 1. Problem number 2, because desires are particular to each individual person, it can't be a universally binding thing, it's maybe particularly binding, and it's conditionally binding in that it only binds the person with the desire so long as they hold the desire. Therefore, it is not universal, neither is it binding, and it takes into desire, which is going to cancel it as even possibly a moral action. Okay? So again, if you're doing the essay for the test that has to do with these two, a lot of the information is right on that slide for you. Let's skip the review and move on to elements of rational agency. Rational agent is what we're talking about. Every individual person is a rational agent. When I talk about the elements of rational agency, what goes into making rational decisions and choices and actions? First of all, to be rational means you have to be able to explain why you do what you do. So a rational agent is going to be able to explain things according to a maxim, right? To have a policy. It's the way that I behave in general situations. So my policy, again, to do this action in this situation in order to get this particular end. And we already said that the maxim is generated by myself. And it's generated when I consider my desires and the possible courses of action that are going to lead me to the fulfillment of those desires. And then I can explain my action in the form of an argument. It's my policy, right, to do this in this situation to get this end. I believe that I'm in this situation, and therefore I'm going to perform this action to get this end. So you can kind of put it out in a very reasonable, step-by-step form. Now, the elements behind all this reasoning are going to be, of course, my desires. I have to have sensuous desires in the first place. Again, at least I say everybody has these things, right? So I'm not going to go through what desires are because I think we've already talked about these pretty well. The second are the optional actions, right? I've got the desires and I've got possible or optional actions that allow me to get to that desire, at least what I think actions will get me to that desire. My prudential reasoning is trying to figure out what the best course is to satisfy that desire. I've got these maxims that I've generated. Then I've got this thing called the pure practical reason. The pure practical reason is not going to consider the desires whatsoever. It's going to be a way that I reason independent of my desires and stuff like that. And this is the key to Kant's ability to say that his ethics can be a universal ethics or an objective ethics, because this is going to provide some kind of objective principle so that I can evaluate my maxim and decide if it's going to become a universal law. So we'll talk about pure practical reason in a little bit. And then, of course, the sixth element in the whole shooting match is really the free will, right? The faculty of free choice. And this is what's going to allow us to determine whether we're going to follow the maxim, at least the maxim that has been judged the right maxim by our pure practical reason, or go after the desires and the actions that are going to allow us to attain those desires. Okay, one of those two directions. Now, the moral action is what we're concerned with. So action by itself, we can't say is morally good or morally bad. An action becomes good based on the motive behind it. Okay, so good action is one motivated by the decision to act out of goodness, or to act out of, I should say, duty for Kant. So here's some other examples you can imagine. Joe decides to help his neighbor build a shed in order to pay him back for helping him put up a fence. Bill decides he's going to help his neighbor to build his shed just because he thinks it's the right thing to do. Now, both guys have done the exact same thing. They've helped their neighbor build a shed. But what is different between them is the motive that led them to this action, right? Joe's act, of course, we can't say is a bad thing, but Kant would say it doesn't have moral worth, whereas Bill's act is morally praiseworthy or morally worthy, okay? And that's because his motivation is the proper motivation. So, motive is going to be very important. Particular acts of the agent who acts out of the motive of duty alone are going to be what we're after. This is the person who has freely incorporated respect into his highest maxim. And the action is moral when it is guided by the rule and by what we call the goodwill. So morality for Kant is really having the goodwill. All right? There's a demand on how we conduct ourselves in light of our desires, because it's going to always have us ignore those desires and subordinate pleasure to duty. So again, this constraint. The goodwill for Kant is the only thing that is absolutely good in itself. Okay, everything else is going to be judged good or bad in respect or in relation to whether the will is good. Okay, and it's a mental attitude. Like I said, it's a respect for the law. The goodwill is always going to say yes to duty. The goodwill always acts out of the maxim of maxims, which is it's my personal policy to adopt only those particular maxims which satisfy the demand of lawfulness, doing so from a motive of respect for lawfulness as such. Overly complicated way of simply saying my maxim above all maxims is that I'm going to act in a way that is consistent with duty because it's my duty. That's my pure motive. That's the person of the goodwill. There's nothing else that moves the will. Remember, it has to freely choose this. It's a sheer act of freedom. Okay, that covers the content, right? The next is the motivation question. Why are we obligated? All right, why obey a categorical imperative? Not why are we obligated. Why should I obey it? Right? I've got to have a motive to do that. And since we've just been talking about motive, the highest motive being duty, we need to think through this just a little bit more, because there's something kind of bizarre with this idea of freedom to choose our motive. And I'll point it out in a second. But question again, why be moral? Well, there's two incentives that affect us but don't determine us. I have a desire for happiness. I've got this respect for the moral law. Right? I can sense them both. The moral choice has to be free. To be moral, it has to be out of respect for the law. And if you're motivated by desire, that's not moral. Which is also one of the reasons, by the way, and why it's on the slide, that you cannot appeal to reward and punishment in the course of training somebody to be the moral person. Because reward and punishment all appeal to sensation. They all appeal to desires, right? They offer a person a reward for a behavior to try to get them to do something. You're appealing to their desiring nature, okay? Not to their reason, not to their goodwill. So whenever you apply punishment or reward, you're appealing to desire, and desire by definition is not moral, so you're not training somebody to be moral. Worth noting, Kant would not think the prison system is designed to make people into moral beings. Let's put it that way. Or spanking a child would not be a means to create a moral adult. Now, the supreme principle, like I said, is respect for duty, acting according to duty for duty's sake. So that brings up this issue of character versus duty, like we saw in the motivation, or the example with the adulterer, and in the example with the shed building. So, acting from duty means for acting from no other reason except out of respect. Acting from character is another way of saying you're acting from your inclination, the type of person that you are, which for Kant, remember, is this heteronomy, right? We're doing something because of some kind of inclination, not because we're freely choosing to. So it means acting from who you are as a person, from your natural motivations. And Kant speaks of a person who is naturally kind and does kind deeds, not out of duty, but because out of character. That's sympathetic to others. That's the type of person we're speaking about as a person who acts out of character. And for Kant, this just is not praiseworthy. Right? It's not anything special to do something for those reasons. Only actions that are done from duty have moral worth. And if you're acting out of character, then you're not acting out of duty. There's the difference. That's why the person who wants to commit adultery but doesn't because they're doing it out of duty is the person that's morally praiseworthy, because they're acting from the proper motivation, as I've said. Here's some other examples, right? Joe teaches his kids how to swim because he loves them and doesn't want them to get hurt. All right? No moral worth there. But Joe teaches kids how to swim because human dignity demands it, that this is just something that does have moral worth, right? This duty involved. You can imagine, a merchant who charges an inexperienced shopper a fair price. Why are they going to charge the fair price to the shopper? Well, out of duty, that would be praiseworthy. If your motive is just to keep your customers happy because this is ultimately going to do more good for you in the long run, then you're not being motivated out of duty, but out of self-interest and out of desire. And therefore, even though you did a nice thing, it's a morally worthless thing. So moral worth is always determined by the principle, which is the principle of doing duty for duty's sake. Hopefully that makes sense. I feel like I'm emphasizing this, but it's so bizarre because it just runs counter, I think, to a lot of our normal intuitions as to what's good in character. And this is one of the reasons that when we get to virtue ethics a little bit later, and classes that I've had in the past tend to feel like virtue ethics is going to offer them something that is definitely lacking in Kant's theory. So the choice of the will, here's where it gets bizarre, has to be free, right? So there's no determination in it. Neither desires or respect for the law are going to necessitate your actions. And you can just imagine what it would be like if they did, right? So the two incentives may affect your choice, but neither determines. Neither is what we call sufficient for acting. Causal determination, we said, rules out obligation. If you're determined to do something, we can't talk about you ought to do something. So, for instance, if you're caused to act according to your desire, then you wouldn't be accountable to any kind of moral law. You just simply had no choice in the matter. You just do what you desire to do. Of course, if you're determined by the moral law, then, of course, everybody would be perfectly moral. And, of course, that's not the case. So, obviously, we don't have determination in that fashion. Each incentive, of course, can motivate, only if the action or the agent freely chooses to let the incentive be an incentive rather than the incentive determining the choice of the will. The choice of the will elects the incentive. So actually choose the incentive, either desire or respect. So we choose how we live, we also choose our motives. And this does seem weird, because when we think about choosing, we want to know, it brings us into at least what we might call a regress problem. Okay, so an incentive motivates you to choose, right? Like, this is my incentive. That's why I'm going to go in that particular direction. So the direction. So if you're thinking incentives motivate your choice, then what we're doing here is we're saying we're choosing the incentives themselves. So if you choose the incentives, what's motivated that choice? I don't know if I'm making this clear or not, because this whole regress problem is sometimes hard to catch on to, right? So if you have choice here and choice here, and you've got an incentive that helps you choose between the two, but you've got these different incentives, and we need to choose between those two, what's the incentive for choosing between those two incentives? It's almost like we have a regress of incentives prior to each choice. But Kant actually believes choice comes prior to the incentives. And that just seems weird, that there's nothing moving our choice. But again, I think that's his point, that our choice is completely free. So Kant says the source of the choice can't be found. All right, you can look, you're never going to find it. That is dissatisfying for some people, to put it mildly. It almost seems like your free choice is somehow arbitrary or uncaused in a spontaneous way. But again, you could think about that as we talk. Okay, so again, it is a radical view of freedom. The famous phrase, ought implies can, we've seen this before, very much associated, right, with Kantian thinking, because the idea implies some kind of libertarian view of freedom, that there's no antecedent causes that incline you in any direction. Your will is free from all causation and undetermined. It's neutral, right? It's free from desire, free from respect. That's why I can go in either direction simply by an act of the will. And if the will were not neutral, then there would be something behind it that moves you in a certain direction, which reduces the ability of being free, or reduces the freedom, which is why choice has to be prior to it. Okay, so that's enough on the motivation question and on this idea of freedom. Let's talk about the ontological source. And again, we're not out of the deep waters yet. As a matter of fact, it's going to get a little bit more complicated as we go. So the ontological source for Kant is this pure practical reason. So we need to talk a little bit about what that means. We already said, where does our maxim come from? It comes from us, right? We posit the maxim. We come up with the maxim. We are the authors of our own policies. And remember, we have to take into consideration desires, action opportunities, and we also have to take into consideration this idea of respect. Now, the law comes from within us, so we would say we're autonomous lawmakers, and we can impose this. And where exactly does that come from? Well, that's where we get into this pure practical reason. So I'm trying to speed up a little bit and not be overly redundant, which I feel like I am at points. But as an ontological source, we're saying, where's the grounding from? Where does this come from? Where does this whole thing rest on its foundation? And for Kant, it's not God. It's not a divine command theory. It doesn't rest in our human nature, and it doesn't rest in convention. It's not just something different societies come up with. It has something deeper, and it's a way to get around an absence of God and absence of some kind of teleological human nature, essentialism, to get us a foundation that is going to be objective. All right, so this pure reason is what we need to talk about, and how it can be practical is the big question. So pure reason, if we're going to define it, just is the idea of reasoning without regard to empirical data. And the empirical data that we're really concerned with here is our desires. Can we reason without taking into consideration our emotions and our desires? Pure practical reason is that this pure reason, cut off from the data, is going to be able to reason about practical things, about actions. Right? We're able to reason as to what we should do without considering our desires. Now, I know I keep saying Aristotle. We'll get to him eventually, but I can't help doing it. This whole concept would, I think, be very bizarre for Aristotle, as you'll see later. He wouldn't believe that you could actually separate desires and reason that radically, because to reason without a desire is reasoning without anything to reason about. In a way, maybe I could put it that way, but we'll see how he gives us this relationship between reason and desire a little bit later. Kant here is saying you can reason completely without desires, or completely without consideration of desires, and you can reason towards actions in that way. Okay? Anyways, reason provokes a feeling of respect, reason legislates, etc. We've seen before. We already said, we're self-imposing, so this law is coming from within us. So again, this pure practical reason resides within us, which is why we impose this law upon ourselves, because it's generated from inside me and through my pure practical reason. Is there an is-ought problem with this? You can think about that a little bit later. Kant actually says that the only is that gives us an ought is the is of rationality, because his moral system is based on rationality. It's just a fact of our reason implies certain oughts and obligations. Anyways, the pure reason is going to determine two things. It determines the norms of conduct, right? Our categorical imperative, our primary principle, and it also determines my motivation, which is to act out of respect. Now, the justification for the moral law, why am I obligated to this moral law, to this categorical imperative? We already said this whole system is asking me to ignore my desires, and that seems like a big request, right? Why would I go through life ignoring my desires? It seems like I should be concerned with my happiness to some extent, and if I am overly concerned with my happiness, then I'm all of a sudden an immoral person, and that just is a tough pill to swallow. We also need to know, is obligation just a figment of my mind? Is there really something like obligation? Like I said, we intuit obligations. We have a sense of obligations, which imply that they're obligated to some kind of law, and a law implies reason. That was the chain of reasoning that we came up with before. Now, moral laws, we're going to classify them as a particular type of thing that are generated from our pure practical reason, and we're going to call them a priori synthetic type judgments, or synthetic a priori judgments, any way you want to cut it. David Hume, who we've seen before when we studied logical positivism, for instance, way in the very beginning of the course, we said there are two different types of judgments that you can have, or two different types of statements, ultimately, that are going to have meaning. You have those that are analytic, which are a relation of ideas, and then you've got those that are synthetic, which we might call matters of fact. And if these are the only two possible types of judgment, then, of course, areas like theology, metaphysics, and ethics would be impossible. That was one of the problems of logical positivism. It cuts off the possibility of having any kind of meaningful moral and ethical statements. Now, pure practical reason, we said, legislates. And as these laws have to be posited or put out there, they're not coming from our experience. They're not a posteriori. Right? We're positing them actually a priori, positing them before experience, from our pure practical reason. Since I have to divorce them from desires, I don't need to look at the empirical data. I don't need to look at a posteriori things, right? I do this prior to experience. And that's why we could generate laws that have no regard to desire whatsoever. So what is this idea of a synthetic a priori judgment? This is a little bit confusing. So as we go, we'll define our terms a little bit. So an analytic judgment is where the predicate is logically contained in the subject, right? And I'll give you an example, right? Subject is P, or S is P. Subject is the predicate. So P says nothing about the subject that the subject doesn't already say about itself. That's what we mean by analytic. True by definition. So here's an example of a analytic statement. The idea that red is a color. Okay, there's nothing about the subject red that doesn't already include the concept of color, or the color concept is built into the concept red. If you understand the concept red, then you already know that this is a true proposition. Right? It's just true by definition. That's what we mean by an analytic statement. That's, I think, a good example of an analytic statement. Synthetic statement or synthetic judgment is going to be a little different. Here, the proposition, the predicate of which is not logically contained in the subject. So we're actually adding something to, or synthesizing two concepts by bringing them together. S is P, where P says something about the subject that the subject does not say about itself. So rather than red being a color, we could say that roses are red. So here we've got the concept of roses in our subject, and then the predicate red, and that's not in the concept of a rose, because there are roses that are not red. Right? So it's not true by definition. We actually need to use our senses to determine that. So it seems like synthetic statements we can verify after experience. We could say maybe synthetic statements are verified a posteriori. But Kant is talking about synthetic a priori judgments. So we're going to have to expand a little bit and talk about, maybe if I'm using these terms without you understanding how I'm using them or what I mean by them, it's worth showing you. So a posteriori, remember, after experience. Okay, a priori, prior to experience. Okay, truths that are a posteriori are logically contingent, where a priori truths we would assume are logically necessary. So roses are red is an example of an a posteriori statement, so that it's a synthetic a posteriori statement, whereas an a priori statement might be something like a square has four sides. Okay, I can know that ahead of time without looking at a square. Now, there are the different combinations we can have that are possible. You've got the analytic synthetic at the top, a posteriori, a priori on the side. Analytic a posteriori, that seems to be a contradiction. Doesn't seem to be anything that fits into that box right there. We said synthetic a posteriori makes perfect sense. All bachelors are happy, all bodies are heavy, roses are red, violets are blue, whatever you want to put in there, that seems to make sense. Those are synthetic statements. I can know about them after I experience. Then the analytic a priori makes sense as well, because these are things that are true by definition. Right? All bachelors are unmarried. All triangles have three sides. All bodies are extended in space. Those are the types of things that are true by definition, and I can know them prior to experience. But it's the fourth box that's a concern, which is why there's a big question mark there, and it's in red. Are there such things as synthetic a prioris? It seems like there are not when you first think about it, because it seems to be contradictory in the same way an analytic a posteriori is, but Kant disagrees. Okay, an a priori synthetic judgment is a judgment that goes beyond mere relation of ideas, yet we can know this prior to experience. You might say, how is that possible? How would you justify this type of thing? And maybe there's no successful justification, but he does give examples and areas where we could find these things. So how are synthetic a priori judgments possible? Well, there's three types that he talks about in the Critique of Pure Reason. You have a priori synthetic judgments in math, in science, and in transcendental metaphysics. Let me give you some examples. Again, the question, are there synthetic judgments that cannot be justified by experience? The answer is yes. They're a priori type because they're prior to experience. And here's two examples. The first is mathematical. The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. That may be the best example if you just want to remember what an a priori synthetic is. Because if you think about shortness of distance, right, it does not include the idea of straightness of line. Right? Those are two separate concepts. Yet we know that this is true before you ever have to draw this on a piece of paper, before you ever experience it. We already know that we're dealing with something that is true, a priori. And it's synthetic in that those ideas are not contained within one another. All right, so that's a great example of an a priori synthetic in math. In science, Kant would say every event has a cause. That's an a priori synthetic judgment as well. An event is just something that happens. An event does not include the idea of causation, right? But experience, of course, cannot test it for all claims that all events, right, are caused. And of course, we can never experience all events, which is one of the reasons that Hume says, causation can't be justified. But Kant says it is justified in a very different way. So again, every event has a cause. It's an a priori synthetic judgment applicable to science. Another one is that material objects exist in space and time. Okay, every experience that we have of an object is actually given with space and time, but space and time we never experience. So it can't be after experience. It's got to be a priori. Kant says they're presuppositions of experience. They must be there in order to have experience. And this will get into his metaphysics and epistemology, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, math and science are very possible in Kant's conception of things because they're dealing with what we call phenomenal objects. The moral statements and metaphysical statements, maybe I shouldn't say moral, I meant metaphysical statements, also fall into this category. So when I say something like God exists, he would say that's an a priori synthetic judgment. But he doesn't think metaphysical statements are as successful because they're not talking about what we call the phenomenal world, but something that we're going to call the noumenal world, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So how are these possible? Well, it's not because the human mind derives these things from experience, because it doesn't. The human mind actually imposes them on reality in order to create experience. And this is where I guess we're already getting into the metaphysics a little bit in the epistemology. So for Kant, there's categories that are actually built into the structure of our minds. The content of the minds is subjective in a certain way. They're my thoughts. And the form of the content might be objective, in that every mind has the same filters that we process our perceptions through. And he believes knowledge is actually impossible without these categories that we bring to the perceptions, right? So you've got the perceptions and the concepts, and united, they're going to produce knowledge. Okay, and the mind is not just something that receives data. It's not a passive thing. For Kant, the mind is an active, constructive mechanism. Okay, so the sausage grinder analogy, that you put in certain percepts and runs through the gears of the machine, and out the other end comes something that has been given form. Okay, that's kind of the idea of Kantian process, how we know. What we know is actually the product of our minds, not something exterior to it. And I might need to go back into that a little bit later because, like I said, Kant's philosophy gets very complicated. Maybe you could say, if you want to be simple, that the only things you know are the things your mind has created. So in a way, we're in this cognitive bubble, perhaps. We don't have access to the real world as it is, which is these raw sense impressions and perceptions. We are the creators of our own world. So if you want to think of you just being trapped in your own mind, I don't know if you want to go that far, but that's one way to think about Kant. Do with that what you will. This is an ethics class, not a metaphysics class. But moving on, since we're talking about operating synthetic judgments, they also exist in ethics. So when I say lying is wrong, that is again something that I'm positing prior to experience. Wrongness, remember, is not included in the word lying. Those again are two separate concepts. But again, they're put together synthetically prior to experience. And that's a reason that they can be universalized. All right, they're not particular things, but they're prior to that. Again, fact-value distinction, wrong is obviously a value statement. Lying is a fact. So how do you argue values from facts? From what is to what ought to be. We already talked about that ad nauseum. He's basically saying that you just see the truth of these things because it's a priori. We're not looking at it after the fact. So it's not like we're looking at lying and then deciding, well, that's wrong, because that would be a posteriori judgment. We legislate it up front, which is why it's a priori. Lying is wrong. We don't doubt that lying is wrong, but it's not because of our experience of lying. We think it's a true judgment because we posit the ethics. Okay. Reason cannot tell us these things are binding. The will has to bind itself, again, via respect. Kant can show that something must be if it is an ethical imperative. So examples: murder is wrong, rape is evil, theft is immoral. Okay, that's enough of that. Self-evident aspect. This is where we're going to get to other questions, right? So justifying the categorical imperative. Kant's going to point to this idea that it's self-evident, right? It's a principle that you can't possibly deny. The categorical imperative, which again is independent of our desires, independent of matters of fact, is just something that functions as our, again, key principle in our moral law. We have to be bound by it, and he believes that reason is bound to this law because it's self-evidently true. Self-evident meaning necessarily true. It cannot be false. And reason, of course, is concerned with truth. That's generally what it pursues. So is it right? Is Kant right that the categorical imperative is just self-evidently true? And I think that's where we got one problem that we need to discuss. I don't think it seems self-evident on the surface. The categorical imperative isn't. The second thing we said is it boiled down to the golden rule, right? And we said it doesn't necessarily do that, even though some people think it boils down to the golden rule. So remember, the golden rule is do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or you could even pick other different types of formulations because we find this in many systems around the world. So it's a command, again, to universal treatment of others, and it's a duty. But the golden rule seems to be empty apart from the consideration of desire, which is one of the reasons it seems to be different from the categorical imperative. To say one should do as one would want done to oneself presupposes that there's a way we want people to treat us, right? And personal happiness is generally going to be the standard by which we act. And Kant has already dismissed desire and personal satisfaction from our consideration. So if the golden rule is the same as the categorical imperative, then Kant has completely misled us with this idea of a categorical imperative being separate from desire. But then again, like I said, maybe these are not the exact same thing. So how to respond to the problem? Does this categorical imperative boil down to the golden rule? If it does, it kind of destroys the system, I think, in a way. But we don't know if it actually does. Now, here's the thing. The golden rule can yield a different result from the categorical imperative on occasion. And if two things are identical, then they would have to have all the same attributes in all possible situations or worlds. So if two rules yield different situations at any point in time or any possible world, then those two rules are not identical and they're not the same rule. So you can try to think if the categorical imperative would lead you to do something different than the golden rule would. You could do a basic thought experiment. You could decide for yourself if this is a good one. But testing the golden rule, what about the masochist? I love these types of cartoons. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. What would the masochist, how would he treat other people? Would the golden rule justify the masochist causing pain to other people? Now, we can stop here and think about it for a second. Some people say yes. Some people say the golden rule can be definitely criticized when you start to look at these types of situations. But since the golden rule does take into consideration desires, it's possible, and I'm just suggesting this, that when you talk about doing unto others as you'd have them do unto you, you need to take into consideration, again, their desires about how they would be treated. So a masochist is somebody who is willing, right, to be treated in a certain way, to receive pain. Other people, if they're unwilling, again, that would be a different situation, right? So you're not literally treating them the way you would wish to be treated because you're wishing to be treated painfully, desiring pain, whereas they're not. Maybe I'm communicating that wrong, but I think there might be a distinction there. Either way, we're just saying that the general rule could yield a different result from the categorical imperative. Second thought experiment. Imagine this situation. Joe, 20-year-old college student, he's never been on a date, takes the woman of his dreams out on his very first date. She agreed to go out with him. He gets all dressed up, takes her out for dinner. They drive up to Lookout Point, and what does he do? Does he do unto others as he would have them done to himself? Again, can the golden rule lead you to certain types of actions? A categorical imperative, I don't think would. So is the golden rule different from the categorical imperative? A lot of people say it is. Okay, but I'll let you decide for yourself whether you think that's the case. Transcendental justification. This is where we get back into the complicated stuff with the Kantian metaphysics. Transcendental justification is trying to justify these things with kind of the if question. If certain things are possible, what needs to be a presupposition that we need to start with? So let's talk about this radical freedom. We said the will. First, basically following that chain of reasoning that we've already been doing, right? We intuit moral obligations. Obligations imply a law implies rationality, and the rationality actually implies a will, right? And the reason implies a will because the will is the ability to act from reason without taking into consideration our desires. So that's why reason implies that there is a will, since we need to be able to choose to follow our reason rather than our desire. As implies can, there has to be this freedom, and there's no free causality, then there's no moral responsibility. Now, here's the problem. I'm just going to kind of jump down to the problem section on this slide. If we're obligated, then we must be free. We've seen this a lot throughout the entire course. Problem is that Kant can't prove we're obligated, and he can't remove this if. Okay. Now, he has these things called the antinomies. These are collections of arguments that are arguing the opposite and trying to show that, we can end in contradictions when it comes to certain things. And his third antinomy actually deals with the issue of determinism and freedom. And he shows that you can't prove that we're free, right? So he can't prove what he needs to prove to get his ethics off the ground. Science, for instance, can't operate without deterministic laws. So is it the case that we're in a universe with deterministic laws? Well, here are the three basic antinomies. The first three, at least, are God, immortality, and freedom. Now, the contradiction is the problem. Each antinomy is a pair of opposing arguments where each argument seems sound yet yields an opposite conclusion. In other words, they end in contradiction. None of the three metaphysical ideas, God, immortality, or freedom, can be shown to be real things, and none are shown to be possible, and none are shown to be impossible. So it's this third antinomy that becomes the problem, right? His moral system requires freedom, but he can't prove we have freedom. So this is simplified version of the two arguments, the third antinomy arguments, side by side, but this might not be something you're going to be able to follow along the lines of, but I'm just going to kind of show you the thesis, antithesis arguments. And if you wanted to follow through, if you've studied logic, you can see how this kind of leads you to the conclusion. But if we start in the thesis column with deterministic laws of nature, these come to prove on line 6 that we have a sufficient explanation, and on line 8 that we don't have that there is no sufficient explanation, which results in a contradiction. So if deterministic laws end in a contradiction where there is and is not sufficient explanation, then we have to dismiss deterministic laws of nature as impossible. Therefore, we end up with what we want, which is free will, or free causality, right? Because that's the opposite of deterministic laws. If there's no deterministic laws, we're free. So his thesis is an argument for freedom. His antithesis is an argument for determinism, because we start with freedom and we end up with the opposite, no freedom. So if freedom entails no freedom, again, we end up with some kind of contradiction, and the conclusion is no free will, therefore we end up back with determinism. So the thesis, I know I'm talking quickly, a thesis gives us free will, and the antithesis says there is none, gives us determinism. And both arguments seem to be sound. This is why it's a problem for Kant. He's saying, I've got two sound arguments. They're giving me different conclusions. What do you do? Well, Kant's solution goes back to what we were talking about a little bit before, kind of the inside versus outside the mind in a way. He says there is and there isn't free will. Each is true, but they're true of different objects. So this is what we call his transcendental idealism. Propositions are not contradictory, because the antithesis, which gives us determinism, is true of what he calls the phenomenal world. And that's not the awesome world, right? It's just phenomenal means it's the world of the phenomena. It's the world of science. It's the world of experience. It's the world of knowledge. It's the world that we live in a certain way. Whereas the thesis argument gives us freedom, which might be true of the things in themselves, or what he calls the noumenal world, which is the world outside or beyond our experience. In other words, it's the world that we never experience, and the world that we can't know because it's beyond our knowledge, right? We're trapped in the phenomenal. Okay? The noumenal is out there. It's the world of the thing in itself. If there's a practical law that obligates categorically, then there must be freedom. We know that that's true. We can't prove that we're free. But if we're obligated, we have to be free. So freedom, we say, is necessary given an obligation. We just can't prove it. We can't remove the if. Okay? And the antinomy doesn't show that this is false. So why should I believe that obligation follows? Or freedom follows obligation? We already talked about that section. I'm going to skip this particular slide. It just does. Talk more about these two worlds, because that's where people usually get lost. If you've never studied Kant, this is going to sound bizarre, and it's going to be difficult. And unfortunately, to at least understand freedom, you have to talk about it. So I apologize. The phenomenal world, like I said, is a world of mechanistic determinism. We all have access to the phenomena, the objects of our knowledge. The things that we know are obviously the things we have actually produced. Like I said, we run our perceptions through these concepts in our mind and produce knowable objects. It's the world inside the mind. It's produced by the categories of understanding acting on the percepts. We have things like space, time, and causality are some of the things that we actually add to our perceptions, because we don't perceive space or time or causality. But we know that those all apply to the objects that we experience and know. And that's part of what we've done through running these things through the sausage grinder of our mind. What we don't know are the things in themselves that are outside, that are prior to adding space, time, causality, etc. That would be the noumenal world. And that may be where freedom resides. It's the world of the thing in itself, or the deontic. And these are not objects of knowledge, which is why we can't say for sure anything about them, because we don't know them. So freedom becomes a transcendental idea. He's making a claim about the noumenal world, that freedom might be true of one world and determinism true of the other. So they're different objects. So if you want to think about it, we could actually think of ourselves from two separate standpoints, from the phenomenal standpoint and the noumenal standpoint. So number one, operating within the phenomenal realm and participating in the causal regularities, I am in part of the phenomenal realm. But again, as a timeless thing in itself, I'm also part of the noumenal realm, that I might be a totally free being. It depends on which point of view I'm looking at myself from. A man can think about himself both ways simultaneously. I'm sensibly determined, but I might be intelligibly free. So he's at least opening the door for the possibility of freedom, which his ethical system needs. Man, again, is an object of his own sense perception, talks about apprehension, all this kind of stuff. I'm actually going to skip past this because I basically summed up what I wanted to say already on the last slide. Yeah, so again, the illustration, you got a man that commits a crime. You got certain antecedent factors that, go before this. You got social environment, occasions, psychological dispositions, etc., things that you would think of as deterministic in your behavior. But in the phenomenal world of senses, all events are the result of deterministic laws, and there's no question about certain responsibilities. But in the noumenal world, reason may operate as this independent thing in itself, where we're now allowed to actually assign blame, punishment, also reward and praise based on this idea. So, okay. We're getting close to the end now. I think I've hit all the big things. I want to talk a little bit about Kant's view of evil and character, since we already said character is something that has to do with our heteronomy, heteronomous law as opposed to autonomous law. The two incentives, as we keep saying over and over again, are our desire and our respect. Our desire for happiness, our respect for the moral law, and we have to freely choose between those motives. And the choice of the supreme maxim is the maxim, actually the choice of your character. And what we ultimately want to do is kind of put the incentive, kind of build into our character the respect for the respect for law. I'm starting to get tongue-tied because I've been talking about Kant for longer than any human being ought to talk about Kant. Okay, anyways, levels of character. The will determines which of the five becomes your character. At level 1, you see the person of diabolical will. For Kant, this is the person that always rejects their duty. Their incentive is evil for evil's sake, and perhaps this is not logically possible. Okay? Or actually, I should say, perhaps this is logically possible, but not actual. Maybe you don't find the person of diabolical will too often in the world. Second level of character is a person of depraved character, right? So he wills duty, but as a means to an end. I'm going to do my duty because I think it's going to get me something. So the desire, of course, or the incentive is actually desire and not actual respect for duty. That's the person of depraved character. The third level is the person of impure character, where you've got a mixed maxim. Do duty for duty's sake, but sometimes duties conflict with my desires. It pulls me in two directions, and sometimes I act out of desire as opposed to duty. The fourth level is the character of weak character, the person of weak character. They choose to act out of duty, but when it comes down to the moment and the pleasure is too attractive, or the desire is too strong and is just overriding your duty, you're going to act against that particular choice, which actually sounds a little bit like Aristotle's incontinent man, who we'll talk about later. And then the fifth level of character is the person of holy character, which is the one who always incorporates their supreme maxim for doing duty for duty's sake. Now, you need a conversion, right? This is not a process where you can be trained away from depravity. He does believe in universal depravity. It almost sounds like a religious type of conception, that everybody has ultimately chosen not to be motivated by respect to some degree. We're all depraved and lack a good will. So we're evil to the core, but we're evil by choice, right? We're freely doing that. And the conversion that he requires is this radical revolution. Like I said, you can't be trained. You can't use reward, promise, and punishment, threat to train people to act a certain way. You just have to choose to be the person of holy character. no process to get us there. We just got to do it, right? It's a single choice and a change of the heart. And the question ultimately then is, how is it possible to choose a new motive contrary to the motive that you already have? Remember that our motive should never consider desire. And it's a motiveless choice if we remember that our choice comes prior to motive. So it's very difficult to understand that. Now, the problem in the end for Kantian theory is that a duty-centered ethics seems to interfere with our ability to live a happy life, at least, or even to live in a very practical way. It seems to be a recipe for moral disaster and moral failure. If there's no connection between my own well-being and what's moral, life becomes a torment, because I'm always told to ignore my own well-being, ignore my own self-interest, ignore my desires, right? Curb those things and just do your duty. And you ultimately feel guilty for wanting to be happy. So it's just possible that the biggest flaw in Kant's theory is, in a way, the impractical side of things. Like I said, the ancient Greeks had a very important place for happiness in their ethical system. They would not have thought that you need to divorce desires and morality. As a matter of fact, now that we're done with Kant, we're actually going to be moving on to Aristotle. And Aristotle is going to finally bring these two things together, our reason and our desire, so that we have what I think is a very tight system, at least a very attractive system. So think about Kant. I apologize it takes forever to go through Kant, but good luck with Kant.